This talk will cover the second chapter of Father Fabre's book, The Adventure of Progressive Theology, and it's titled Immanentistic Roots of Contemporary Theology. In this chapter, Father Fabre introduces the role that theology plays in linking faith and reason, focusing on the contemporary situation, which demands an examination of modern negative theology. In this study, Father Fabre will highlight the influence of modern philosophy upon the way this new negative theology is conducted and what conclusions are made as a result. So Father Fabre, in this first part of the second chapter, he wants to explain how this new theology that he titles the death of God theology has really rejected the classical realist and metaphysical positions that lead to the position of radical denial, which has been baptized the death of God. And he does so by quoting John Arthur Thomas Robinson, who is an English New Testament scholar. And so Robinson says, quote, "It is not a question, therefore, of rejecting God, but really of saving him, indeed placing him in the conscience of modern man in the way that suits him," so modern man. That is, of replacing the old field of theological intentionality, which is now outdated, with a new horizon of intentionality that is in keeping with the internal dynamics of the intentionality of modern man. And so it must therefore be acknowledged that modern man is no longer able to grasp the language of classical theology and philosophy. For example, that God is presented with the terms nature, substance, cause, relationship, because they are linked to a particular type of representation of the world that Robinson says today no longer has and can no longer have a positive meaning and function. Therefore, the death of God would constitute an indispensable and beneficial step for the recovery of the authentic God. It is affirmed that a man of today who lives in the intentional climate of his time cannot not be an atheist, but at the same time, says Robinson, cannot remain an atheist. And so the explanation that he's giving is that really the modern quote-unquote death of God theology has as its motive to really save modern man from atheism, sort of placing the blame on traditional classical philosophy and theology that has led to the current situation, or a modern contemporary situation, which God is largely rejected. And so using, once again, Robinson, Fabre allows him to explain how this death of God theology came about. And what Robinson explains is that it is a theology of defeat and surrender in the face of the negations of modern thought. So basically being submitted to the critique of modern thought from Feuerbach and Nietzsche to Heidegger and Sartre. And so the dimensions, he says, of this surrender have been indicated in three ways. First, that God is superfluous in the intellectual sphere, in that in both realms, science and philosophy, there is no place for God, insofar as God has totally escaped the apprehension and understanding, and man can no longer feel the need to pose the problem of God. Ultimately, God has lost all intentionality for man. The second reason is that God has been relegated to the emotional sphere, because not only does man no longer feel the need for God or religion, but he is convinced that this reference is harmful to him in a world that has emptied itself of the sacred. That is, in a world whose essence, to put it in Heidegger's words, is to become a world. It is the secularized world, and secularization means that man should accept the responsibility of his own destiny without looking to place it upon the gods, hoping for any kind of helpful providence or enlightenment. And the third reason is that God is intolerable in the moral order. And here, even more than the categorical imperative of Kant or the radical existential liberty of Sartre, is working the scandal of evil. In this way, there is the affirmation that, quote, a God who causes or permits the suffering of one single child is morally intolerable, unquote. On the other hand, with the progress of culture and science, sensitivity to pain has increased. Thus, the tension breaks the arc of the spirit, and man prefers to remain alone with pain and his own problems, sort of rejecting God, a God who would permit such things, saying he's of no use to me. And so contemporary atheism, which theology must be able to deal with, does not therefore have a uniform origin, since negation arises from different intentional spheres. And so Fabro notes, thus, on the one hand, the Anglo-American death of God theology limits itself to taking note of a fact, that is, to accepting the result of the investigation into the contemporary world. If, he says to Fabro notes, if we are allowed to express ourselves in this journalistic style, which means that atheism or a rejection of God has sort of seeped into all spheres of life and culture, to whoever considers them and from whomever considers them, they show not only their death of God, but also the absence of God. And so God no longer interests anyone. And that is, as Fabro will point out, the sort of starting point or the situation of fact that this new death of God theology begins with. And so one can certainly not deny, says Fabro, that here we are faced with the phenomenon that has been called secularism or secularization, in the sense that little by little, in culture, in life, in science, in philosophy, and in theology itself, all intentionality or meaning has been taken away from the name of God, and now God remains an empty name, a vacant semantic. Thus, quote-unquote, secularism has become a euphemism for indicating the lack or absence of God in the whole sphere of conscience. And so, theology, if it does not want to fail in its task, says Fabro, must go to the roots of this process, or reversal of the situation in which we have gone from dominance of the sacred over the profane to the recognition of the right of the profane alongside the sacred, up to the invasion of the profane in the sphere of the sacred, and casting out the sacred itself, setting aside the gospel and religion in general. And so he concludes, Father Fabro, that contemporary negative theology really blames the loss of God on the traditional conception of God and has proved it or deemed it unsustainable. And therefore, even if it is now inherent in a certain type of culture and rooted in our formation, it is nothing more than an idol from the viewpoint of modern theologians. Thus, the modern theology, or the modern theologian's death of God theology, concludes that even what is rejected can be this idol only, and not God as such. And so, in other words, what is perceived is that the traditional classic theologian really doesn't understand or know the authentic God, but really just an idol or a shell of what God is. And the death of God theology is able to discover and place man in contact with the authentic notion of God. And so, abandoning that idea of God is the first step on the part of theology in order to reintroduce God into the world. And so Fabro notes that this new or negative theology involves a process which brings a method of negativity to a level or intensity never before reached in the Western tradition, and identifies two stages or moments. First, negativity itself as a process of man's freeing himself in order to approach God. And second, the absolute positivity of God himself, which reveals itself as the bottom in God's immanence to the world and to man. And so the negative moment, firstly, it expresses the liberation that is achieved by modern man with a process that began already in the 13th century, a liberation from every metaphysical restriction and exterior restriction from ecclesiastical faith, and therefore the fulfillment of his freedom. Here the guide is Bonhoeffer. He quotes him, Fabro quotes him saying, quote, "Man has thus learned to face any problem, no matter how important, without resorting to the hypothesis of the existence and intervention of God," end quote. And this is not only in science, in art, and even in ethics, but now in an even clearer way, Fabro notes, in religious questions. Quote, "It is now evident that everything can go on even without God," end quote. And so the sign and proof of this is that the more one insists in the proofs of traditional apologetics, the more one obtains its negative effects of distancing modern man from God. Modern man is now aware that he has broken the ties of childhood and that he has reached his maturity, and he is convinced that he can now do it himself, looking upon classical theology and philosophy as a sort of crutch or a restriction to the full realization of his capacities. And so according to Bonhoeffer, quote, "God himself teaches us that our lives as men must now continue as if he did not exist," end quote. And he goes on to say that he is pleased with an increasingly paradoxical dialectical terminology. Quote, "The God who makes us live in the world without resorting to him as a working hypothesis is the God before whom we always find ourselves. Before God and with him we live without God. God allows us to confine him outside the world, and this is exactly the way, the only way by which he can be with us and help us," end quote. And this dialectic that is less revolutionary than it may seem at first sight, but it is not difficult to see that it really just remains faithful to the Lutheran formula of Deus absconditus et revelatus, and in the end has the same negative effect as simul justus et peccator, the other Lutheran formula. And so the first moment is the negative moment, man's liberation, and the second is a positive moment, which expresses the ontological determination of God as depth, instead of the other classical determinations of God as transcendence, or placed, quote-unquote, outside or above the world and man, which is purely spatial symbolism and really extraneous, as they would say, to human reality. And this then is replaced with a psychological symbolism. And here, Fabro uses Paul Tillich, a German-American existential philosopher. He uses Paul Tillich as the guide, quoting him to explain the importance of the new semantic. Quote, depth, used in the field of the spirit, has two meanings. It means both the opposite of superficial and the opposite of high. Truth is deep and not superficial. Suffering is deep and not high. Both the light of truth and the darkness of hope are profound. There is a depth in God, and there is a depth from which the psalmist invokes God. The ultimate meaning of this intentionality of the divine, referred to as the foundation, is understood at the extreme limit of immanence, through the preferred dimension of depth. The name of this infinite depth is inexhaustible, and the foundation of every being, it is God. It is this depth that this word God means. And if this word does not have much meaning for you, translate it and speak of the depth of your life, of the source of your being, of your supreme interest, of what you take seriously without reservation. Perhaps to do this, you must forget all the traditional doctrine of God. Perhaps you must forget even the very word of it. But, Tillich continues, if you know that God means depth, you know enough about him. You cannot be called an atheist or unbeliever. You cannot think and say, life has no depth, life is superficial. Being itself is only superficial. If you could say this with complete seriousness, you would be atheists. Otherwise, you are not. He who seeks to know depth seeks to know God. End quote. And so according to Tillich, therefore, depth, although a dimension of space, is at the same time the symbol of the quality of the Spirit. And this leads to the definitive positive way as the conclusion of the negative way. So there's two stages. And so ultimately, this new theology of negativity will find that it is necessary to identify God with depth, and ultimately will intensify as much as possible the identification of God with the world, or the immanence in his immanence in the world, and to reject with the utmost firmness the idea of God as that which is above and beyond all things, ultimately freeing oneself at last from transcendence and the supernatural, which are purely external and result in the negation of God, according to the death of God theologian. And so the conception of God as depth therefore has an advantage, according to Tillich, of meeting with Julian Huxley's monistic naturalism, according to which it makes no sense to explain the world as resorting to a principle outside of the world, that is, something that is foreign to the world. And so Tillich affirms that theology must accept this criticism of naturalism towards the supernatural, and specifies what the orientation for the new concept of God must be. Quote, God is the name for indicating the strength and sense of a reality. He is not identical to the totality of all things. No philosophy or myth has ever affirmed such absurdity. But he is understood as a symbol for the unity, harmony, and power of being. He is the dynamic and creative center of reality. The expression Deus sive natura, used by men like Scotus and Spinoza, does not affirm that God is identical with nature, but rather means that God is natura naturans, that is, the creative nature and the creative foundation of every natural reality. In modern naturalism, the religious content of these statements has almost disappeared, especially for those philosophical naturalists who interpret nature in terms of a mechanistic materialism, end quote. So instead it is a question of taking up the religious meaning of naturalism from the bottom up, of returning to the experience of the sacred that has always been essentially an experience that has inspired and supported the various types of classical theology, such as whether it be the ipsum esse of scholasticism, or the universal substance of Spinoza, or the identity of spirit and nature in Schelling, or the beyond subjectivity and objectivity of James, or the universe of Schleiermacher, or the all-cosmic of Hawking, or the creative process of values found in Whitehead, or the progressive integration of Weimann, or the absolute spirit of Hegel, or the cosmic person of Brightman, or any of these concepts, that they are based on the immediate experience of something intimate in the value and being of which everyone can become aware of by intuition, says Tillich. And so all of those are based on that immediate experience of something intimate in the value and being of which everyone can become aware of by intuition. And so Tillich here adopts Heidegger's terminology by saying this experience is the ecstatic character, since it is an experience that transcends the ordinary experience. And here then, it is given a transcendence that has both a metaphysical and sacred character. Therefore, Fabro explains, it is clear that Tillich, and in his own way, Bonhoeffer, they will ultimately remain prisoners in the Heideggerian aeon, and therefore fall into the ties of negativity of the principle of immanence. And what returns then in the world of Tillich and that of Heidegger is the demand of being, and the appeal of to the dialectic of being and non-being as the foundation and structure of truth. But what, and then Fabro will ask, but what being or of what energy or act is he speaking about? That is to say, what is the intentional direction of the foundation of this relation? The answer, as much for Heidegger as for Tillich, leaves no room for doubt. The relation is constituted in the transcendentality of the subject. And so this transcendence, explains Fabro, is the Dasein, a transcendence of finiteness that in Heidegger is expressed as a relationship to the indeterminate historical world, and in Tillich is the relationship to the historical world determined by the revealed religious event. The difference between the two concepts is that while for Heidegger the relationship that is existence always takes place in finished projects, for Tillich and for all dialectical theology it remains tense and suspended from the dialectic of being, non-being, of everything and nothing. In fact, notes Fabro, it is in this context that Tillich proposes a super-personal God and a God above the God of theism, because he is a God whose affirmations arise from the radical doubt that lies at the basis of modern thought. And so, in this situation, Tillich himself confesses, the God of ecclesiastical language should disappear. And so Father Fabro concludes with an explanation of the modern principle of immanentism, and he explains that the reasons why modern man is no longer able to understand the meaning of traditional theology, and therefore why it denies access to the transcendent or refuses to accept things such as the supernatural or faith and grace, is certainly due, as Robinson and the other Death of God theologians assert, to the fact that these terms, transcendence, supernatural, grace, and faith, after the expulsion of metaphysics, have lost all meaning to modern man. But, says Fabre, the theologian must not limit himself to identifying this fact. He must ask himself the reason for the catastrophe and how the orientation of the spirit has changed so radically in recent times. How it's gone from things that are in the infinite to the finite, from God to the world, until man has arrived at the point of defining his own reality and defining it as a being in the world, which is the precise formula of constitutive atheism. He says the answer is possible only by going back to the original diremption, to the original constitution of the being-thought relationship. And he does so by contrasting the classic Christian thought with modern philosophy and how they are really polar opposites. For that classic Christian thought, being is the foundation of thought. Whereas for modern philosophy, it is thought in general which founds being. For realism, the classic Christian thinkers, being implements and moves and guides consciousness, while for modern philosophy and immanentism, it is consciousness with its structures that make possible the appearance of being and its structures, which can only be structures of consciousness because they are founded upon consciousness, that is, on the basis of that experience of the nothingness of being that is called to found the new type of transcendence, which is at the polar opposite of the classical one. For Fabre, then, it is clear that the Death of God theology is a phenomenon that is proper to Protestant theology, which, as he says, has twice lost its contact with classical theology. First, with the Lutheran principle of sola fides, which has denied any relationship with reason and left consciousness alone with the revealed Word of God. And then, secondly, the modern principle of consciousness, which, as Hegel said, brought to completion the work begun by Luther. And so just as the first immanence led to the detachment from visible authority in the sphere of faith, so the second was deepened in the reduction of being in general to the spontaneity of the subject. Therefore, the theoretical logos is lost, and the cogito, as Heidegger pointed out after Fichte and Schelling, becomes volo, which is the will to power with reference only to the self. And so on this basis, concludes Fabre, there's no doubt that atheism is inevitable. It is the only coherent conclusion. And with a technical formula, it can be shown, he says, that the modern principle of immanence is intrinsically atheistic in that it coincides with the radical affirmation of the I as the foundation, and therefore involves, or the result is, the radical expulsion of God according to the entire intentional quality of consciousness. In other words, and with an even slightly more technical formula, admits Fabre, it means that the essence of the modern principle of autonomy of self, inasmuch as it is the position of immanence referred to being, is and cannot be other than the negation of transcendence in the classical sense, which refers to knowledge in which the first value of freedom and the first step of classical theism, in its fundamental meaning, consists at one time. And so what has happened then is the transcendence of God as an emergence of ipsum esse has been replaced by the transcendence of the Dasein as a projection of man's will into the world. This distinctive negativity of the inexhaustible and inaccessible emergence of divine perfection followed the negativity of the I, which, after the fall of the pseudo-absolute idealist, so idealism, returned completely to the foundation of the nothing, and made the nothing the foundation of the finiteness of being, according to the analysis of Dasein of Heidegger and Sartre. And so Fabro concludes that the project of the death of God theology, of rediscovering God by accepting from contemporary thought and the contemporary world the platform of the negation of God, he says it is something illusory and impossible. It really is a project of despair, founded on the pretense of being able to resurrect by returning to the poison that caused death. If you want to say, Fabro says, if you want to say that this type of theology may have some apologetic efficacy in sparking interest in religious questions in certain environments that are maybe less sensitive to these fundamental questions, he says this is really just a matter of tastes and circumstances. But I do know, he says, it is a method devoid of any theological and speculative consistency. And so the death of God in modern philosophy and contemporary theology is simply the conclusion of the logic of the principle of immanence, which is a principle in itself meaningless, devoid of any intentionality, because the nothingness from which the consciousness is formed can do nothing more than drag nothing to the consciousness itself. Moreover, it is not understood how, from the empty cogito volo, the consciousness can ever go outside of itself and give itself a world, quote unquote. So therefore, to summarize, understanding the motivating factors of the modern and contemporary theologian, Fabro does not see how the modern theologians can avoid falling into the closed circle of immanence, which is ultimately atheistic. And that concludes this second chapter of the work, The Adventure of Progressive Theology by Father Cornelio Fabro. Thank you very much.